Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Greg Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's guest is Jason Stein, a former state capitol reporter for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and previously the Wisconsin State Journal. Stein is a co-author of the book More Than They Bargained For: Scott Walker, Unions, and the Fight for Wisconsin. His work has been recognized by journalism groups such as the American Society of News Editors, the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, and the Association of Capitol Reporters and Editors. I spoke with him about the stress of a high-profile journalism job, stepping away from the profession, and his thoughts on the state of civic life.
So I think the first thing that we need to have as Americans is perspective for what a good government we have, what a good society we have, what a good economy we have. If you went to someone in Syria right now and you said, "Hey, what do you think of the American government? Isn't it a lousy government?" What would they say? What would they say? They would say, "What a dream, it would be to live in a society like that."
Stein was recently named the research director for the Wisconsin Policy Forum, an independent, nonpartisan research organization analyzing Wisconsin state and local government finance, education, and economic development. You just took a new job.
I did.
You're kind of cleaning out the office right now this week. Has it been hard to step away from what you've been doing for the last 15 years? Or do you see what you're going to be doing as kind of an extension of what you've already been kind of doing in your career?
I see it as an extension of what I've already been doing. And I also see it as very, very hard to do. And it is very, very hard to do. I mean, I loved my job. I'm going to do one more day of it. Maybe I'll write one more story on Monday. But I loved it, and I wasn't looking to leave. I wasn't actively looking to leave. So this was a situation where the Wisconsin Policy Forum, which is this new merged organization of two extremely old and respected organizations, approached me and offered me what I felt was a very generous offer, and I felt like I had to take it. And I'm glad I took it. I mean, my only regret is that I can't do both jobs at the same time. That I have to leave the old one, and so that's what I'm going to do.
It's only so many hours in the day, right?
I'm always wanting there to be more hours, but I haven't found a way to get them yet.
What excited you about the opportunity?
A couple things. I mean, one, these are organizations that I have long respected. So one of them was the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, which was created during the Depression, I think as a way of sort of looking at how government takes in money and spends it. It was a very well-respected organization that I learned a lot from the people who worked there over the years, Todd Berry, the president, and Dale Knapp, who was the research director. Todd retired, and then the Taxpayers Alliance merged with the Public Policy Forum of Milwaukee. And so that organization is more than 100 years old. And it's sort of comes out of this movement you see around the country, in those years, I think, of this progressive era politics of wanting government to be professional, work well, not be captured by interests that would be contrary to the public interest. And, again, both of those organizations do really deep, sophisticated, meaningful research about how government works. And I really feel like working there, you're still working for the public in the way that I've always felt I was working for the public as a journalist. So those things were really attractive to me. And then I'm a little bit of a wonk. So over the years, I've written a lot about state budgets, a lot about finance, topics like that. And so I felt like this was, even though it's certainly going to be very challenging for me, it was work that I could do and that I would learn a lot and that I would enjoy. So, I've thought about leaving journalism for a long time, but never found a job that would cause me to actually do it. And so this was the one.
Was that partly because you wanted to have a job that would have kind of a civic impact? Is that kind of what you were looking for?
Definitely that's part of it. Yeah. I mean, that would be, intellectually satisfying. That would be, I guess, sort of morally satisfying. All those things. And, this one really has that. I mean, the other thing that I think was attractive to me about it is that you have two really, really old organizations with this great profile. Everybody wants to say they're nonpartisan, but there have been a lot of groups that have cropped up in recent years saying that and not really meaning it, not really embodying it. And these are groups that do embody that. And so they're very old and they have this rich tradition, but at the same time, they're merging, they're becoming something new. So there's still an opportunity to, I don't want to say take them in a new direction, but at least express their traditional values in a new way. And so it was a combination of all those things that drew me in.
What are you going to miss about being a day-to-day newspaper man?
Well, you have a tremendous, I guess, responsibility, but also ability to help the public understand things. And I think, in some ways, maybe I never realized until now sort of I don't want to say the power, but just the responsibility or the opportunity that you have as a journalist, because, now a significant part of what I'm doing will be, spending large amounts of time to get a journalist to spend a short amount of time on something and share it with the public. And so, you sort of realize, wow, what a responsibility those journalists have as they pick stories. And I was able to do that in my job. So I was able to, not that I had carte blanche, that I could do whatever I wanted, but I could do a lot of what I thought was important for the public to know about their government. A lot of that I got to write about. So that was part of it. And then the other thing, it's just a lot of fun. I mean, they always, it's like the joke from All the President's Men, when there's that moment when they say they're going with one of the really big stories and one of the editors says to another editor, like, well, what happens if this, if this bombs, if we're not right about this, if this is not accurate? And the other one says, well, we've all got to go out and get real jobs then. And so that was the way I always felt about it. I mean, it's like very hard work, but it was never felt to me like, a job, like putting on hubcaps or something on a car,
You said words like responsibility, but I'm wondering if you felt pressure in the job, especially early on, when you kind of working in a high profile newspaper job at the Capitol, for a big newspaper, statewide newspapers. Did you feel like that pressure?
I did. No, it's a really insightful question. And I did feel that, especially when I started at the Wisconsin State Journal. So I was a business reporter for the Wisconsin State Journal and really had no aspiration to be a political reporter. I wasn't particularly interested in it. But my editors asked me to switch over and cover the Capitol when they had an opening. And I agreed to do it. And I sort of immediately, on the one hand, really liked it. And on the other hand, felt constantly nervous about it all the time. I think because I felt like, rightly or wrongly, when I was covering like mutual funds or banking, that I wasn't letting democracy down if I didn't do a good job. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There was like some feeling like, well, I'm writing about something that's important, but it's not all important to public life. Whereas in the other job, I really felt pressure, and I never really went away, but it got to the point where it was manageable, and that was where I was at, and I was, comfortable in the job. So part of the difficulty of leaving is just always difficult to leave with something you're comfortable with. And I was doing it for 13 years. I was in the Capitol. So I did have that. And so now I'll be uncomfortable for a while doing this new thing. So.
Was there a point where it kind of clicked where you mentioned there's just a level of nervousness that you just always have with a job like that, but was there a moment where it kind of clicked where you're like, I'm semi-comfortable or comfortable enough to be semi-confident in the job?
I suppose so. I mean, somewhere between starting and doing that for the Wisconsin State Journal and then doing that for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Because so I started at the Capitol in 2005. Then I went to the Journal Sentinel, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel in March of 2010, which I moved my desk about 8 feet across the press room. So it was like literally in all the world, anywhere of people who switched jobs, there could not be really a smaller physical shift than the one that I made in switch, So I think over that period, I became comfortable, and it was probably good because, shortly after I started at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, we were really plunged into really, as a state, and certainly within the State House, into very controversial and tumultuous times. And so I'm really grateful that I didn't have to start the job in that environment, because that would have been really, really difficult. I sort of knowing the way things work, knowing the way they had worked, knowing the way things, not the way things were supposed to work, but at least sort of what the traditions of the building were, helped me a lot. I was able to lean on that when everything, went through a lot of changes.
Do you remember your first day kind of on the beat, working in the state capitol?
I remember a couple of the first things that I did. I'll give you a light one and a heavy one. One of the first things that I did was I covered a hearing about Spaceport Sheboygan. Does this ring a bell for you? Do you remember this?
No, I do not.
This is an actual thing.
Okay.
This is an actual thing. So at this time, there was some talk. I think this was in the context of in 2005, you started to have this idea of personal spaceflight or commercial spaceflight, so I don't know if Richard Branson of Virgin Airlines was already in the mix for that, but you had people like him that were sort of promoting this idea that someday you would be able to get in a rocket and go up into space the way you can go to Hawaii, if you have the money, right? That if you have the money and I suppose meet certain health standards, right? And so Sheboygan was being talked about in that context because it's on Lake Michigan. And so the idea was, rockets could fall down into Lake Michigan. There would be like a little Cape Canaveral.
How did I miss this? This is amazing.
This is an actual thing. And I mean, obviously there was a certain amount of snickering associated with this, right? Mm-hmm. And they created an authority, a special government vehicle to investigate this possibility. And there was no, as I recall, at least at the time, there was no talk of putting any real taxpayer money into this. So it was just sort of creating a vehicle for people to explore this possibility, which, as far as I know, has never gone anywhere, because I'm pretty certain there aren't spaceships launching out of Sheboygan today. So that was my first story that I worked on. Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, that was a pretty memorable one, actually.
And what was the deeper one? What was the harder one?
The deeper one was my colleague at the Capitol at the time, Phil Brinkman, who is now the city desk editor at the Wisconsin State Journal. He had received a tip that then Attorney General Peg Lautenschlager, whose son is actually running for Attorney General now, Josh Call, that she was actively looking into, and she was working with the U.S. Attorney in Milwaukee at the time, that they were looking into some things that then Democratic Governor Jim Doyle's campaign had done. And he had sort of one anonymous source on that, but he needed a second to be able to report on that. And so one of the first things I did was call everybody I knew who might be able to confirm that. And, I eventually did get a second source. And so we eventually did publish a story that they were looking at some things that his campaign had did. And that investigation never came to anything, but it was a big deal at the time that you had one Democrat investigating another. And I think, some of the difficulties in relating that the governor and AG at the time had, that was a context, right? That she had at least nominally opened an investigation on him.
Is it different when you're a business reporter, you're cultivating sources, as you do as a journalist, that's what you do. Is it different when you're a business reporter? or like when you're working at the Capitol? Is it harder to develop relationships, to cultivate sources?
As a business reporter or as a Capitol reporter?
What's the difference, do you think? I mean, is it harder inside that building to do that as a journalist versus outside of it?
I would say it's much harder as a business journalist, actually, because as a business journalist, you're writing about private entities that I think quite rightly do not need to give you a lot of information about what they do. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that they don't have to, but they don't. So, if you hear that a company is about to lay off people or, that there's some turmoil or problems going on within a big employer in your area, there's not a lot of information. You really have to cultivate human sources in many cases that will give you this information, because even if it's a publicly traded company and they have to disclose certain things to Wall Street, there's still not that much that they really need to tell you compared to the government. I mean, the government, number one, you always have an opposition party, no matter what. Right. So they have a sort of a built-in reason to tell you everything bad that they think is happening, and even some things that are not happening, are not actually happening, they will tell you. And then you have the open records laws and the FOIA laws that allow you to get a lot of information. And government creates so much paper and so many reports and has so much data that it's just hard for people in government to hide the ball for very long. At least about really big things that they're doing. Small personal foibles you can find out about and never get confirmed. But, the big stories eventually usually come to the light. So it's actually a lot easier, I think, to cover government in a deep way than it is to cover business in a deep way. I have a lot of respect for business reporters that are able to do that.
Was it hard at all to build trust with legislators? I mean, or to have them seek you out as somebody that they want to give the scoop to? What are some of those? Yeah. How do you develop those relationships in that building? I mean, you mentioned that people want to tell you certain things, but sometimes they don't want to tell you certain things.
Right. And it tends to be the things that they don't want to tell you. Those tend to be the things that the public really needs to know about.
Yeah.
I benefited from the fact that it was an easier time in 2005. I mean, it certainly felt like a very tumultuous time. So, I mean, obviously George Bush had won re-election, and that was what was seen at the time as a very polarized environment. And we were on the way as a state toward big wave Democratic elections in 2006 and 2008. So the ground was shifting under, Republicans' feet at that time. But it was a lot more cordial, collegial, probably atmosphere in those days. And so it was probably easier to develop trust and be seen as trustworthy in that environment. And, it is probably more difficult for a reporter coming up to do it now. And the other thing that was easier was that this was before certainly newspapers were struggling in 2005, but it was before the really difficult times of the Great Recession that had such an impact on newspapers. So I also got more time, I think, to learn and study things. And I think really that is what builds relationships with sources more than anything, is getting things right. And so, I mean, I was fortunate in that I got to learn how everything worked at a little slower pace. I think it'd be really difficult to come into journalism now and learn how things work, because there aren't as many older, experienced colleagues that you can rely on within your news outlet. And there isn't as much time to go to people in the outside world and learn and listen. And so, to a certain extent, I've been able to, in recent years, I think, draw on those sort of fat reserves, so to speak, that got built up over years,
What do you think is the biggest misconception by the public of what you do, of what you've done over your career, of what a state capitol reporter is?
I mean, I think the biggest misconception would be that there's constant talk, whether you're talking to, I don't know, a Rotary Club or a group of high school students, the thing that everyone will always kind of keep coming back to, the scab that they will always sort of pick at, is your bias as a media person. And how you're just a human being, as if there was anything else you could be, right? Right? As if there were days where we had, angels come down from the heavens and they would write newspapers. And now, isn't it a shame that we only have human beings that can do it? And I think, probably the thing that they don't understand, I think, about it is that we are just human beings, but we do that are imperfect and biased, but that we do have some objective methods that we try and bring to what we do to try and keep ourselves honest. At least that, if somebody gives you a specific thing to look into, that you should have ways that even if the story starts out as A, that you can correct it to B as you learn more facts about it. And I think what the public fails to understand is that the real danger is not that we as media become too biased, but that we get too few resources and too little time to apply the methods that we've always used to sort of get to good results. And it's the resources and time that are really the problem, or the thing that we need to be wary of, I think, more than anything. I mean, not that, and to the extent that we need to be worried about biased media, I think we really need to be equally worried about biased consumers of media who aren't willing to, go outside of a certain silos of Fox News or, MSNBC or what have you.
Have you seen, during your time at the state capitol working in the press room, the numbers of journalists go down during your time? I know if you talk to somebody like Steve Walters, that's even more dramatic.
So Steve Walters, a long time newspaper reporter. He was for the Milwaukee Sentinel, longtime State House reporter. Then after the merger, the Milwaukee Journal, Milwaukee Sentinel merged, and he continued in the State House. So many years. He was a professor of mine, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's a mentor of mine over the years. And then I eventually never took the exact job he had because he was a bureau chief, and I was just a State House reporter. We didn't really have a bureau chief anymore. But, in some ways sort of got to maybe carry on a little bit of his tradition. So, yeah, I mean, certainly you talk to somebody like Steve or somebody like Dick Wheeler, who was the, longtime dean of the press corps. Yeah, I mean, there's been a tremendous loss of, people with, and of course, if you have someone who's covering, covering the assembly, and someone who's covering the Senate, and someone who's covering the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and someone who's covering the governor, and somebody who's covering, a couple people in Washington, D.C., and then you boil all those people down to two people or three people, do they find as much? No, they don't find as much, because all those guys were working 40-hour weeks, or guys and gals were working, 40-hour weeks, and a couple guys working 50-hour weeks is not gonna cover all the waterfront that those other people used to cover.
Did you feel like things got missed by not having just the sheer amount of people? It's, when you have a small group of people and you have only maybe one or two people covering the state capitol, they have to write the main story of the day to a certain extent. And it's harder to write those edge stories or to dig on those edge stories. Sure.
I mean, you never know. This is always a difficulty in life. You never know what you don't know. So it's always hard to say, what would you have found if you had been looking for what you weren't looking for? So I can't fully answer that question. I mean, I think one saving grace, I guess, is that there's less duplication of resources over the years. So a lot of those a lot of those reporters in the old days were all still covering the same thing. And one of them was covering for commercial radio. And, there were more newspapers, there were more outlets. There was there was not only the Associated Press as a wire service, there was UPI as a wire service. And a lot of those guys and women were doing were writing the same stories. But they weren't always doing that. And I think the news coverage is still pretty good, and in some ways really good in terms of covering the things that are topical. I think it's a little harder, though, for the media to set the conversation and go look at other things and say, yes, your elected officials in Madison and Washington, D.C. are talking about X, Y, and Z, but we think you also ought to know about, R, S, and T, and that is harder to do now.
Speaking of Steve Walters, did he give you any pieces of advice when you started working at the Capitol?
Sure. Well, one thing that he said that I always appreciated was that he always had the attitude that he wanted good competitors. And so I remember him saying that to me when I started, that he thought I would be good and that he was pleased. He didn't. You could look at it differently, right? I mean, if you're a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, you could say, well, I hope all the Wisconsin State Journal people are lousy because that makes it easier for me to shine. But he never looked at it that way. And I think he was right to look at it that way. I think we do benefit from being challenged. And I did always try and challenge myself, at least to not turn away from writing about subjects that are hard. I think that's one of the biggest biases in the media, is to write about things that you already know about. And I think there's always that mental block when something comes up that's really complicated and you don't know anything about, to just say, I'm so busy. How am I going to cover that? I'm just not going to cover that.
Can you tell me a little bit about the culture of the press room at the state capitol? What was it like to work there among your colleagues? Peel back some of the curtain on what it's like to work there.
I think it's a really weird environment, but I think a really good one. And I'll explain the weird part first and then the good part. What's unusual about it is that you're in a small round room with all your competitors. And typically the doors open and you have classes walk by and politicians walk by and all kinds of people walk by, and they all come in. They will come in and talk to you. They will ask you where the restrooms are. You'll hear people out in the hallway talking about you, saying this is the news media. And so, occasionally you'll have someone come in. Over the years, some people would come in with video cameras and start interviewing us, sometimes in a hostile way, sometimes not. And you're there with all your competitors. So it would be like if you worked at a bank, right, trying to originate loans, and right next to you was somebody that was trying to originate loans for a different bank. It would be really weird, right? And that's how it is. So you end up taking a lot of cell phone calls in the hallways. I always wondered how they managed to do it before cell phones. There'd be a lot of people talking in really whispered voices about the whatever big scoop that they had, or going out to payphones, I guess, if it was really big. So there's that aspect of it, but there's also a real collegial aspect to it. And I learned so much over the years, just from my colleagues and, overhearing their interviews with people and how they did their job, and having them say, well, you're totally wrong about that opinion that you just expressed. And, oh, why? And, oh, well, yeah, okay, I didn't know that. So it was a great environment. I mean, that's certainly one of the things I'm going to miss the most, is being in that room, where so much was always happening.
Did you ever feel like a zoo animal when the classrooms were going by?
You do a little bit. Yeah. But again, but even that is not all bad, again, in that, it sort of impresses on you on a daily basis that it never ever really gets old working at the Capitol, and the beauty of that building, because it's one of, I think, the great state capitals in the United States. But it was always nice to be able to see the building from the eyes of a fourth grader or something like that, to be able to sort of get a little bit of the wonder, and not become cynical about that place.
One of the big stories that you covered, and you wrote a book about, which was the 2011 protests at the state capitol, massive protests.
Right.
What was it like being in the press room at that time?
It was surreal. I mean, the whole experience was surreal. I remember at one point looking at the website of the New York Times, and they had two big stories on the website at that moment. And one of them was the Arab Spring protests in Cairo. So, one, it was protests in Cairo that would eventually topple the government, and the dictator of that country. And the other one was my workplace, 10 feet away from my desk, what was happening out in the halls of the building where I worked. And so that was sort of an amazing thing to think that one of the two biggest stories in the world, at least in the eyes of an American newspaper, was what was happening in the building where you work every day. And so it was really tumultuous. I mean, I remember I helped to credential journalists in those days. And so I remember credentialing journalists from Germany, Mexico, France, some of the Nordic countries. They were from the Washington, D.C. bureaus. They weren't literally flying from Paris to be there, but they were still there because they thought that an audience in Paris would want to know about what was happening there. And so, I mean, it was an amazing historic time. It was very stressful. I remember one day I worked 22 hours straight. It was certainly difficult to have, a very loud, chaotic workplace. I mean, there was one day where I didn't go to the restroom for a long time because I knew it was going to take me a half an hour to get to the restroom because the hallway was so packed. It would take me too much time to get there and back. Whereas, I mean, it's literally like 20 yards or something. I mean, you can walk it in no time flat. That was the building at that moment. It was so packed with people and, so much was happening in it.
That's crazy. A couple of years later, you published a book based on it. And you went back and you did some interviews, follow-up interviews with some of the important key players in the whole story.
All of them that who would talk to us.
And the one that didn't was Scott Walker.
Scott Walker didn't. He did not interview us, or we could not interview him for the book. That being said, I mean, we had day jobs in which we interviewed him regularly, and including here and there in one-on-one interviews about, and the book was all about the things that we were writing about anyway. So we got to ask him what we felt were the essential questions. We certainly would have liked to have asked him more questions for the book, but he was thinking about running for president, and he ultimately did. He was planning to write his own book. And so I think, for those reasons, he did not agree. But, most of his, a lot of people associated with him did, and, both on and off the record. So, we didn't feel that there were any holes in terms of factual holes in the book. We would have liked to have had more of a narrative around him. But we felt like we could do the book in a very credible way, especially because all the GOP lawmakers were very, very willing to talk to us about everything that they did, or at least to take questions about all of it.
Did you learn anything about that whole situation going through the book that you didn't know at the time when you were doing the day-to-day reporting?
Sure. Many things. I don't know that there were any huge blockbusters that came out of the book, but certainly we learned a lot about what was happening behind the scenes because, the book is really told as a narrative, like a novelistic format. And that requires a great level of detail that is not gathered for newspaper stories. So really we had to sort of re-report all the major events, and certainly you learn a lot of things. I mean, there were a few things that we learned. I mean, we certainly learned about a meeting in which then President Obama's campaign manager and deputy campaign manager sat down with Wisconsin Democrats and told them in no uncertain terms that they had to stop the recall elections against Scott Walker from happening. That had not been actually reported before. So, I mean, that would be one example. We also reported on some of the meetings between union officials and Democratic senators that happened in Illinois, and reported on those for the first time. So there were certainly new details, although I wouldn't want to oversell them.
What is your understanding of why that decision was made to go forward and push that legislation by Scott Walker's administration? I think it shocked a lot of people.
Sure.
It was, I guess you could call it a bold move by the governor at that time. I mean, it kind of shook Wisconsin, as evidenced by the protests. So what were some of the decision-making process, do you think, that went into that?
Anytime something happens in government, I think there's the policy, there's the politics, and there are the personalities. And I really think those three things determine the big actions. And that if you look at purely the policy, the politics, or the personalities, if you exclude any one of those elements, you will fail to understand what is happening consistently. And so that decision, you had the policy. The policy was that the state was facing a roughly 2-year, $3 billion budget shortfall. And the governor had promised to not raise any taxes to close it. He did raise some taxes associated with the earned income tax credit, but that was a very small part of the solution. So he felt that he needed to cut, and a lot of what state government spends is money that flows through to other local government and schools. So he needed to make some cuts, and he needed to find a way to sort of backfill those cuts. And that was the part of Act 10, which is the law. That's the part that required state workers to pay 12% of their health care and about 6% of their pensions, which was for the average state worker, was about an 8% cut in state pay, take-home pay. So there was that part. That's the policy, right? That he needed money. The politics was that he also needed to win re-election. Unions were obviously a big opponent of his, and that by combining those compensation cuts with a repeal of most of collective bargaining, including the part that allowed unions to get money and dues that they could use to play in the political world, that helped to, push him in that direction. And then I think there was the personality of it. And that was, the governor had been a Milwaukee County executive. So he had been the head of the local unit of government in Wisconsin that probably has the greatest financial challenges, and had constantly butted heads with the union at that county. So he had a very negative experience of both of what the finances of local governments were and of what the relationship of local elected officials with their unions was. And so I think for all those reasons, all those three reasons, the politics, the policy, his own personality, he was uniquely ready to make this big move. And obviously there's other interest groups, there's other conservative interest groups that are coming to pass on that. I mean, he had a long relationship with the Bradley Foundation of Milwaukee, which, the Bradley Foundation had long advocated for reducing the powers of unions. Especially public sector, not just public sector unions, but especially public sector unions. So I think it's all those things combined, that lead to that proposal that he made in early February 2011.
What would you say, looking back, it's about 7 years now?
Right.
What's the legacy of that legislation, that just the event of it?
There are a lot of legacies. I don't even necessarily feel that I'm able to comment on all of them. I mean, certainly, I think in the short run, it helped local governments absorb the cuts that the governor and lawmakers made to their state aid. It has certainly, I think, appears to have contributed to a higher rate of turnover within public sector professions, whether that's people, some of it is people leaving the profession of, state service or local government or school service. Some of it is because it blew up sort of the seniority rules that had governed how local governments work. You now see much more willingness of like teachers and people like that to leave and go to other school districts because they don't have to worry about building up a bunch of seniority anymore because that's how the union world worked. So that in a weird way has decreased the leverage that school boards and superintendents have over their employees, which I think is a really counterintuitive outcome. But I mean, I think it also one thing it helped adjust is insurance, like healthcare especially, had become a bigger and bigger piece of compensation to the degree that it was difficult for like beginning teachers to, it made sense if you were about to retire and needed a lot of healthcare. But when you're at the beginning of your career and you actually need to make money and buy a house and, pay for kids and things like that. So I think it helped adjust that mix a little bit in terms of how people get compensated, even though it probably also contributed to the overall compensation being less. So it had all those impacts. I think the big challenge for local governments right now is after 7 years of extremely tight property tax caps and, limited increases in state aid, and a low unemployment, it's very hard for them right now to attract and retain good employees, which is huge for a local government because it's a very labor intensive, especially if you're a school, like really that is your main cost is hiring people who teach children. So that is the challenge. I think that it's, local and state elected officials have to grapple with at this moment. In a year or two, we could be in recession, and then people that are working for local governments would be much more inclined to stay in those jobs. And some of that turnover issue would subside a little bit. But right now, I think that's a big challenge that they face.
So that's a story that got a lot of attention, international attention. Were there stories that you worked on that you thought should have gotten more attention, that you wish got more attention, that you wish got more play, or things that the public maybe missed? Stories you just wanted to have more legs?
That's a good question. I mean, to a certain extent, I believe in my readers. I believe in, voters. And so I think to a certain extent, I've been willing to accept the judgment of the crowd about what I do. So if there's something that I do and I think it should get a lot of attention and it doesn't, part of me is inclined to look and say, well, what is the reason why? What is the good reason why? I'll say this. I mean, I think one of the big challenges that we face as a state is the disparities in outcomes for people of color. And I think that's a problem. It's not just a problem for people of color. I mean, it's a problem for anybody that pays taxes, anybody that wants to live in a functioning society, right? It's a challenge for a business that wants to hire people and, needs as many people as possible in the workforce being productive. I mean, and I guess maybe one of the biggest, pleasures that I had or maybe one of the best feelings I had as a journalist was I was not the primary reporter on this story, but I contributed a lot of stories to our coverage of problems at Lincoln Hills School for Boys and Copper Lake School for Girls, which is the state's only real juvenile prison north of Wausau. And one of the things that I was really surprised by is I did not expect that you would have a lot of public interest in the outcomes of young people, mostly of color, mostly from urban and poor urban areas, who have by and large committed serious crimes. I did not think that the public would care much that there were a lot of problems at that prison. And I think I was wrong about that. Certainly the public cared a lot more than I ever thought they would. To the degree that elected officials have passed bipartisan legislation to completely overhaul the way we handle juvenile corrections in this state. And that's an open question as to how successful that overhaul will be. But I think that it's really important that we get good outcomes for anyone that enters the correction system, especially juveniles, because, they have their whole life ahead of them to either be productive or counterproductive in society. And so that was a real privilege to me to be involved in those stories, and it greatly gratifying to find that the public read those stories and I think felt that they were important.
This might be an obvious question, or an obvious answer, but do the changes that have been enacted recently regarding the juvenile system, would that have happened without the press covering those stories, without you and other reporters writing about that facility?
No, I and this is one of the very rare times that, in general, I feel like the media's ability to influence the narrative and influence elections and public policy is exaggerated. I think people put too much importance on what the media does. Now, maybe it'll be interesting to see if I still believe that, a year from being out of the media. I always used to joke with a colleague. I always had a colleague, George Hesselberg of the Wisconsin State Journal, who would always say, he would complain about the media. And I would always say to George, I'd say, you are the media, George. How can you complain about it? You are the media. But, maybe when I am no longer the media, maybe I will look at it all differently. But right now, I feel like our role is exaggerated. But that was one case where our role was not exaggerated. I mean, really, without, I think, two individuals, Patrick Marley, my colleague at the Journal Sentinel, and also Molly Beck of the Wisconsin State Journal, without the stories that they wrote, and, maybe a few of the stories that I wrote, that change would not have happened, and would not have happened to the degree that it did. We would not have had a corrections secretary resign and a new one be appointed. We would not have a whole institution with hundreds of inmates and hundreds of workers shut down and new ones being created.
Did that teach you anything about the power of what you do, the responsibility of what you do?
It didn't teach me something, but it reinforced a belief that I've always had, which I've always believed that in the media, and to a certain extent, this will be the approach I take into my new job, that it is not the job of the fact finders to worry about where the facts are going to take us as a society. So in other words, I never felt that it was my job to worry about, well, if I report this, then so-and-so will lose an election, or such and such legislation won't pass or will pass. I never felt that that was my job to worry about that. And I feel like, too, one of the reasons why it's important not to worry about that is then you start getting into the thinking of what's possible. So, it could have been easy to say, well, none of this stuff matters. Why are we still writing about this? It's not going to matter because no one is going to do anything. But that's not the point. The point is to give the public and policymakers facts and then let them decide what should happen, and not get into this game of becoming a pundit, and sort of applying punditry to your own work as a fact finder. So it reinforced for me that if you just keep your head down and tell the public what you think matters, extraordinary things happen sometimes. And we've seen that with the Me Too movement. I think that if the people that had written the stories about Harvey Weinstein had only thought about what had happened when other journalists investigated Harvey Weinstein, we would be living in a different world than the world we live in at this moment.
Why the heck did you start in this business, the newspaper business, being a journalist in the first place?
So I've always loved to write. I've always loved to read. And I've thought about doing different things. I worked in dictionaries for a while. I did some internships at a couple dictionaries. I did a fellowship right after college where academic fellowship where I worked on old French legal documents for a year and did a master's degree about that. So I thought that I wanted to work somehow in lexicography, like making dictionaries or being a linguist or something like that, or a novel writer or something like that. But I did some volunteer work as a human rights observer in Latin America. And while I was down there, there were a lot of just really interesting stories that I thought would make good journalistic pieces. And I started freelancing and just placing very, small stories in small publications that covered Latin America. And I really enjoyed it. And I thought, hey, this would be a way I could write all the time. And I got a master's degree in journalism at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison, and did an internship at the Wisconsin State Journal, and just one thing led to another.
Does having that background in, I guess, dictionaries, words, just in general, language, you speak a couple languages,
mm-hmm.
Does that change the way you write? Do you write differently because of that background?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it makes you much more analytical about language. And, I studied Latin as an undergrad, and that really makes you very analytical about language because the classical Latin is like really complicated, and it's like, it's like the old joke that Mark Twain told about. He went to a play in German. He was watching a play in German, and at intermission, somebody said, well, do you want to leave or do you want to keep watching the play? He's like, no, I want to stick around and hear what the verb is. This is because they'll put the verb at the end of a sentence, and sometimes there's this like tremendously long sentence. But so it makes you like more analytical about it. And the other thing that I sort of took away from it is when I was at Webster's New World Dictionary, which is actually the dictionary that the Associated Press recommends that you use, I did an internship there, and there were still there a couple of long time lexicographers who were involved in writing words. And one of the things that I observed that they would do is whenever we were talking about a word, one editor in particular would always open the dictionary and look at the word. And like, this is a guy who like helped to write like a huge part of the dictionary and really to me knew everything about words and their nuances. But yet the first thing that he would do is go and look up the word and sort of look at the knowledge that other people had put together about that word and see every nuance. And I think still strikes me as a researcher about the importance of always checking what you know and what you think you know, and also about the precision of language. And, so whether I'm writing a narrative or whether I'm writing an investigative piece and I'm trying to get the lead to say precisely the thing that I want it to say and have precisely the connotations that I want it to say, and not ripple out in an inaccurate way. I still do that sometimes where I will pick up the dictionary and look at an individual word that I'm thinking about using to make sure that it's not smuggling with it some connotations, like, that it doesn't have some connotation. The car doesn't have these bad connotations in the trunk of the car that are going to take my story in a way I don't want it to go.
Probably a lot of your colleagues or a lot of people that you've worked with will maybe check this podcast out, hopefully. Is there any, or maybe there's other just young journalists that are listening to this? Do you have any advice for what journalism should be in the next 5-10 years? Does it have to change from what it's been? Maybe just in the way that you connect with readers. I mean, what kind of pieces of advice, some parting words of advice you would have for your colleagues and for the people coming up?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll start out by just talking about one thing that I scribbled down to share with you is just some of the principles that I'm going to try to take with me into this new job, which is still researching and writing about government. So it's basically this, it's not journalism, but it is journalistic in a sense. The first one would be to always get at the truth and to approach the truth by trying to talk to as wide a range of people on all sides as you can. The second one is to, I think, always be transparent. And the one thing that I think a journalist can advocate for is transparency on the part of government, and to believe in sort of the wisdom of crowds and the wisdom of your readers and the wisdom of voters. And then the third principle would be the knowledge that this is it's sort of an iterative process that, for a newspaper, it comes out every day, and the stories online get reposted and written through multiple times. So to constantly be embracing the uncertainty of what you don't know, and also constantly revisiting what you thought you knew. And then the last one is that, in journalism, you have to always be attending to the urgent things, but you can't lose sight of the important things. And I think we are at an ever greater danger of that. Is that we get drawn into, the tweet of the moment that is urgent, and it feels like the thing that we have to do, but we still have to find time for the things that are going to make life today different from life 20 years ago, the big, important shifts.
How would you evaluate the health of our government, the health of our press? Obviously, there's a lot of chatter about, is journalism collapsing in some sense, and with newspapers struggling, sometimes laying off, and there's a lot of fear about what the future of journalism will be. There's also fear about where the government's going and whether it will be held responsible by journalism, and just political division in this country in general. How do you feel about the health of our society?
So here's the first thing I would say, that one of the things I feel grateful for is that as a younger guy, I was able to spend time in Europe and in Latin America. And in Latin America, I was dealing with people that often experience violence, sometimes extreme violence at the hands of the state. So I worked with, refugees and refugees in Guatemala who had literally seen their villages exterminated in the late 70s and early 80s. So I think the first thing that we need to have as Americans is perspective for what a good government we have, what a good society we have, what a good economy we have. If you went to someone in Syria right now and you said, "Hey, what do you think of the American government? Isn't it a lousy government?" What would they say? They would say, what a dream, it would be to live in a society like that. So I think the most important thing I think that citizens and journalists and everyone needs to have is perspective about what is valuable about the institutions and the society that we have. And it doesn't mean that every day isn't a battle to maintain that, because it is a battle to maintain that. But I think, that's important context. With all that being said, I think that there are a lot of threats for important institutions. I think there is an erosion of the media as an institution that can act as an honest broker for society. I think to a certain extent, the court system is often no longer seen, especially high courts are often no longer seen as fair arbiters of societal problems, but instead as sort of politicians in robes. For institutions like the one that I am going to, whether it's like the Congressional Budget Office or, just this nonpartisan research group that I'm entering, I think that there are less and less space for people to just be nonpartisan, to not pick a side, to not advocate for one side. People are less willing to accept that. One of the things that I often heard from readers is people saying, I know you really want X. I know you wrote that story because you want X to happen. And it just by and large was not the case. And I think because more and more people are in that mindset, they have less and less ability to believe that someone else would not be in that mindset. So, definitely one of the things that I'm going to try and do in the new job is do what I can to sort of strengthen that, strengthen those institutions, I think, in society that are nonpartisan, because the sort of the partisan muscles within our society are getting stronger and stronger. And some of those other muscles I feel like are atrophying a little bit.
Is there anything else you want to say? Or perhaps you'd like to declare for governor like the rest of the state is doing right now?
No, I know very certain that if I ever were to run for governor, that would be the moment where I had maybe taken leave of my senses. I actually think it is such a hard thing to do, to run for governor. I feel like it's very hard to know what running for governor really is and then still want to do it. I think it's very possible to want to do it because you don't know what it is. I think it's very hard to know what it is and want to do it. I guess the thing that I would leave on that I think is really important for journalists and just society that I've been thinking a lot about is I feel like there's less and less embrace of uncertainty in society. And I think one thing that would be really healthy is if people would talk more probabilistically about life and about social programs and about, to say, it's a lot of people, I feel like more and more people say, well, I'm certain that X, Y, or Z is going to happen. When in reality, if you ask them to bet $100 on it, they would not bet it. They would not take the bet. That people pretend to have certainty about things that they don't have it. They don't really have it. And so I think that's one thing I'm going to try and do in my new job, is to try to emphasize to the public as, how many things we don't know. How we can make educated guesses and reasonable assumptions, but that is what they are. They are not decisions made with perfect information.
Thank you to Jason for taking some time to talk to me. Been reading his work for years. It was a pleasure to talk to him. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Also, you can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.